Hello and welcome to the Weichert Report's After Action Report on President Trump's recent trip to Asia. I'm Brandon Weichert, and this is your world. It's been more than a week since President Donald J. Trump returned from his historic trip to Asia. Upon his return, the president decreed that it was the most successful diplomatic trip of any president to Asia. To be fair, the president should receive plaudits for his work in rehabilitating America's relationship with the Philippines. However, there were also several critical issues that were unfortunately simply left on the table. Ian Bremmer of the Eurasia Group believes that there was virtually zero progress on any issue that matters to America, asserting that such lack of movement was ultimately the biggest win for China. Now, Bremmer is a noted critic of the president. And I think that he probably is overstating the, quote, failure of President Trump's trip. However, unfortunately, Bremmer's assessment is mostly correct if you are only concerned with what's going on in the near term. In the medium to long term, however, things might change, especially if the president and his advisors keep Asia at the top of their foreign policy agenda, which would be a stark change from the previous two administrations. After all, according to the Trump administration officials, North Korea is now being placed back on the International State Sponsor of Terrorism list, which means they are now open to increased levels of sanctioning from the United States. This was something that the Trump administration was holding off on, hoping that a diplomatic solution to North Korea's nuclear problem would be resolved. As of now, they seem to be putting on the pressure. So this automatically elevates the region in the Trump administration's foreign policy agenda. Plus, keep in mind that everyone kept saying that Trump would not be able to essentially pivot and be an effective diplomat in chief, that his personality and bombast would not be commensurate with pushing American agenda through in Asia at the diplomatic level. And yet, we saw how Trump was greeted. Now, the American media and much of the Western media, I think erroneously, painted it as the Asian states and leaders were essentially playing Trump, especially the Chinese, that they were appealing to his sizable ego in order to put him into a more compliant mood. I actually think this is a completely ridiculous belief. After all, according to Trump administration officials, the president made a strategic decision before arriving in Asia to win over the various Asian leaders by playing nice. And such a maneuver, despite what the media keeps saying, is actually in keeping with the president's true nature. While the president's public persona is one of bombast, people who have done business with the president and who know him personally for years claim that the outlandish figure who tweets at early hours in the morning and attacks his detractors is not the full measure of the man. In fact, one can easily infer that the president must be able to work amicably with a host of different personality types, given how large his real estate business was, how profitable it was, and how appealing his celebrity was to people all over the world, even before he ran for president in 2016. We know that Trump can be appealing and diplomatic, and that was precisely how he appeared on his Asian trip. With the exception of his pronouncements throughout the trip on North Korea, which actually were in fact consistent with American policy. Whereas detractors like Eli Ratner, who was the principal advisor to former Vice President Joe Biden on Asia, claim that Trump's behavior in Asia left the region confused about the direction of U.S. policy. The truth is more likely that this is but the first step in a longer-term mission to rehabilitate American credibility and presence in Asia. This is a region that has become increasingly dynamic and highly competitive, and one that has been left largely ignored by U.S. foreign policy for years. The United States may remain the most powerful country in the world. However, it is no longer the only powerful country in the world. We now live in a multipolar world order in which there are many centers of power spread all over the planet. If the United States does not maintain constant commitment and interaction beyond simple trade with a region like Asia, U.S. foreign policy will become increasingly difficult to maintain. Besides, American staying power isn't what it used to be, particularly in Asia. After 30 years of missteps, short-sightedness, and downright stupidity, America continues to appear as a power in decline to much of the rest of the world. Compare this to the perception of China, which seems to be ascendant. This is the world's perception. Even though the United States still retains the largest economy in the world, for now, has the most modern military that has really the only real global reach, at least on paper, and is the only Western country with a stable population and fertility rate, for now. In politics, perception is power. And in diplomacy, the personal touch is everything. Remember, we're talking about nations which are nothing more than communities of unpredictable people, and not widgets which are unchanging and predictable. Therefore, whatever tangible success a president may or may not have on his first trip to Asia, the fact that he is reaching out at a personal level and connecting with those individual leaders in Asia, dispelling their worst fears about him and his intentions, as Trump clearly did this last trip, is an important step. Personal diplomacy goes a long way. And don't forget that personal diplomacy was a key element of former President George W. Bush and his diplomatic policy. It bore significant fruit when Bush dealt with both China and Russia throughout his 8 years in office. Whatever one's problems with the former President Bush may have been, and there are many problems with the former president, his ability to work alongside and connect with many foreign leaders, especially leaders of countries that usually do not share American strategic aims or values, such as Russia and China, was profound. This was all thanks to the many hours and days Mr. Bush spent wooing fellow world leaders like Vladimir Putin of Russia and former Chinese President Hu Jintao at Bush's ranch in Crawford, Texas. Given the way that Trump interacted at a personal level with so many of these different Asian leaders, the same may hold true for Trump in Asia. Think about it this way, in terms of perception being the power in politics. Even though the media was prattling on about how Trump offended everyone and missed opportunities because he focused his speech at the APEC summit in Da Nang on reinforcing his campaign themes on upholding national integrity, of upholding the national interests of the United States, even if it meant risking the trade with other countries, particularly those in Asia. Those statements actually comport nicely with the current dynamic that is controlling or reigning over Asia today. Today, Asia is in a hyper competitive, highly economically dynamic, great power competition between countries like China, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Australia, India, even, and a retinue of other Asian states. Of course, India is not an Asian state, but the Indo-Pacific, as the Trump administration kept referring to it. Despite their reliance, these countries' reliance on what we know as quote unquote free trade, international trade, in order to empower their meteoric rises, the fact is these countries are highly nationalistic. These countries are very much tethered to 19th century worldviews on the nation state and its role and sovereignty. Therefore, Trump's recent comments actually comport nicely with the geopolitical realities in Asia today. This is something that no president of the post-Cold War era has ever managed to do effectively. This is why many Asian states, not just rivals like China, but also allies like South Korea and Japan, had no problem taking advantage of America's open-handed trade policies while giving us little in return other than increasing trade deficits. One of the biggest complaints that President Trump had when he campaigned for office was that American leaders were not standing up to their foreign trade partners and rivals, like China. He said that he would protect America's national interests, even if it meant eschewing sweetheart trade deals with China. Of course, sweetheart for the moneyed interest in America, and sweetheart for China's geostrategic ambitions of becoming the most dominant power in Asia. One thing that we saw, despite how the media presented it, was that the so-called budding bromance between Chinese President Xi Jinping and American President Donald Trump was not as loving as some were claiming. You see, during the president's summit between the two leaders in China, the Chinese proposed that the two leaders unveil a plan to widen foreign firms' access to China's vast financial industry. However, to Beijing's consternation, according to a Wall Street Journal editorial report, Washington wasn't interested. The offer was made a second time during one of Mr. Trump's meetings with President Xi at the Great Hall of the People. This was the historic instance no American president had ever been granted this kind of audience. It's because President Xi wanted something. This is what he wanted. However, hours after Air Force One took off from Beijing, despite the Trump administration not agreeing to the deal, China unilaterally announced the opening of on its own, clearly wishing to box the United States in. And let me tell you something, previous American presidents would have essentially given in to China because of the fear of how it would affect markets if they went back on the deal. The cold shoulder from the White House, according to the Wall Street Journal, reflects a fundamental shift in how the U.S. manages its relationship with China, one that suggests a, quote, bold gamble and a rocky road ahead, despite the bonhomie. Please remember also, if you remember the inaugural postings at the Weichert Report on Forget Brexit, focus on slowing demand in China, I was agreeing with people like hedge funder Kyle Bass and also like China scholar Gordon Chang, who now I realize has been proven consistently wrong. What I will say is this. What was going on in the summer of 2016 with slowing Chinese demand coupled with the decline in China's stock market could have very well done significant, even irreparable damage to the political system in China. However, the Chinese Communist Party did manage to navigate that problem effectively. But the only way that China is going to maintain its competitive edge in the region and continue funding its meteoric rise is if they are able to gain access to the have greater access to America's financial markets. If they can open up access to China's financial markets to Western firms, China can continue to make the pivot that it needs to make away from a manufacturing industrial production economy into a post-industrial consumption knowledge-based economy, which is the essence of the Xi Jinping, Colonel Lu Mingfu China dream. What Trump is doing right now is complicating the implementation of that aspect of the so-called China dream. And in so doing, we're actually going to get the kinds of concessions that the Trump administration is hoping to get from China vis-a-vis the North Korean situation. These are actually very good moves. So they're going to be painful in the near term, and many analysts will say that it is a failure of diplomacy. But in fact, this is effective diplomacy because we are working together on specific issues. We are being fair to each other when we can. But we are also, as Americans, not going to simply allow the Chinese to just walk all over us. And this will actually create a newfound respect for the United States in China, and it will also fundamentally alter the perception of the United States as a state in decline in the rest of Asia, which will have reinvigorating effects on American foreign policy in the geopolitical sense in Asia. These are all good things because Asia is the most dynamic part of the world economy. And the United States absolutely needs to continue to do business in Asia, and we cannot continue to allow for China's rise to go unresponded from our part, especially because China's rise means they're going to try to push out America from the region, and that will be economically destabilizing for the United States and, in fact, the entire world. On this, he asserted a few weeks ago that China would love nothing more than for America's trade outlook to mirror that of, say, Brazil's. But still, these deals that Trump did with China are actually in the short term very good. And also, because of these deals, Trump did exact from the Chinese a promise to intensify sanctions on North Korea. Yet this promise was nothing new, because the Chinese Foreign Ministry has been affirming China's commitment to imposing harsher sanctions on their wayward North Korean ally for months. However, the image, again, perception, the image of China's President Xi Jinping and America's President Donald Trump arm in arm, having a purported bromance when they really weren't, does go a long way in creating the perception of solidarity between the region's two most important players, especially as the Trump administration is now yet again reimposing sanctions, despite whatever the Chinese may actually want. They're reimposing sanctions on North Korea, and they're not giving in to China willy-nilly on things like opening up Western investment into Chinese financial sector. So these are good things. The biggest letdown, however, was in the failure to realize the official formation of what's known as the Quad Alliance of states in Asia. Going into the trip, many American foreign policy experts were hailing this as the beginnings of the rise of a new military and economic alliance, which would consist of the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, that would be a counterweight to China's growing economic and military influence in the region. Hugh White, a leading geostrategist in Australia and also a supporter of closer ties with Beijing, was highly critical of Trump's APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, speech in Da Nang, Vietnam, and described President Trump's subsequent private meetings with the leaders of the Quad states as being a, quote, damp squib, end quote. Despite this, however, accounts differ on the effectiveness of Trump's personal diplomacy, and I am inclined to believe that Trump's appearing and meeting with these leaders and showing that he's not this whatever caricature the Asian leaders have come to believe actually does go a long way toward rehabilitating the American position in the region. One has to crawl before one walks, and certainly be able to walk before one can jump. The part of the problem with the United States has been in foreign policy an issue of leaping without looking. Although Hugh White is right to criticize the American tendency to believe just showing up, in his words, at APEC is enough to signal America's commitment to the region, especially as China's rise becomes all the more challenging to the old status quo ante in the region. Yet, after 8 years of the previous Obama administration's handling of the region, in which Mr. Obama continually asserted his intention to pivot the United States away from the Mideast and Europe into Asia and then falling flat, coupled with what Colin Dweck described as the Obama administration's retrenchment strategy of nation building at home, the signal was sent out that America was looking for the exits during the Obama years. And during the George W. Bush administration, as the global war on terror came to consume every aspect of American foreign policy, Asia simply fell away from the top priority. In either event, former Undersecretary of State for Asia Kurt Campbell described the Obama administration's obsession with focusing on Russian aggression in Ukraine, rather than completing the much ballyhooed pivot to Asia, as being akin to, quote, kids chasing a football, end quote. This, more than anything that President Trump has either said or done or not done or said, contributed to China's rise and America's current predicament in Asia. Contrary to what people like White believe, the United States simply cannot come strutting in and fundamentally change the natural trend of the region in which it is pivoting slowly toward China. This will take a concerted effort on the part of the Trump administration, and it will be a long-term plan. The first step then is to create a positive, lasting image and relations with the leaders of a region that has become highly skeptical of American intentions and reliability. This, coupled with the positive economic growth rates in the United States, as well as the examples of strength that the administration has displayed on everything from standing up to North Korea, to repelling Bashar al-Assad in Syria and the use of chemical weapons, to soundly defeating the physical manifestation of ISIS in northern Iraq. This has undoubtedly reassured American allies throughout the world, especially in Asia, whilst complicating the geopolitical ambitions of America's rivals, such as China, and rogue states, such as North Korea. President Trump's trip to Asia did leave much to be desired. However, politics is the art of the possible, and what's in the realm of possible for America and Asia has decreased significantly since the 1990s. This is not the fault of Trump. In the realm of the intangibles, the president undoubtedly scored some key points. It is likely that Asia's leaders got to see the side of the president that has never been accurately portrayed in the Western media, and it is likely that they walked away with a newfound respect for the man, as well as a deep understanding that he is truly committed to maintaining America's staying power in Asia, even in the face of nuclear threats from North Korea and from economic and geopolitical competition from China. As long as the Trump administration builds off these new relationships that were forged and the new image of America that has been slowly crafted in the region since Trump assumed power. America's position in the region will be solidified. Its allies will be assured. And the United States can actually compete at the geopolitical and geoeconomic level in Asia as never before. Trump's Asia trip did what it could, and Trump did it fairly well. Give Trump's Asia policy time, because as Churchill noted, time heals all wounds. And Lord knows, America's Asia policies, since the early 90s, have been seriously wounded by bipartisan American leaders. For the Weichert Report, I'm Brandon Weichert. Have a nice day.